Welcome to the opening program for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History's Black History Month Virtual Plus experience for 2023. All month long, ASALA will be bringing you programming that will highlight and celebrate the Black life experience through virtual and live action programs. Please be sure to check our website for a complete list of our programs that will be available all month long, brought to you by ASALA and our many illustrious sponsors.
Tonight is special because tonight we celebrate excellence. It's the NBA All-Star Game, the best ball players in the world ready to shine. But basketball won't be the only thing shining tonight. Tonight, the NBA turns the spotlight on our HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and the vital role these institutions play in molding students who go on to excel in every field imaginable. I still remember my time at Florida A&M, the spirit of camaraderie, the feeling of pride, and the quest to strive for higher. To be in a place of learning where I felt prioritized and understood made me feel seen and heard. That experience gave me a stronger sense of myself and gave me the tools to blaze my own trail. So now, I invite you to join in the tradition held at many of the 100-plus HBCU campuses across the country. The singing of James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing. Mr. Johnson was himself an alum of the prestigious Clark Atlanta University, so it's only right that his alma mater perform this meaningful anthem. Here to perform Lift Every Voice and Sing is the Clark Atlanta Philharmonic Society.
Let us march on,
At this time, we will now welcome Reverend Dr. Shively Smith, who will provide the blessing for the festival.
My sisters, brothers, and siblings, please join me in a moment of reflective stillness and blessing. To the God who has brought us thus far on the way, and the great cloud of witnesses who stand in chorus and declare that we are not an abandoned or forgotten people, we give thanks. We convene in gratitude for the time to remember, for the time to name, for the time to renew our collective spirit of resilience, resistance, freedom, and peoplehood. We give thanks. We are thankful for this month of memory and action in service to a solace theme of Black resistance. We are thankful for the blessing of our forebears and their acts of resistance and deep speech. We are thankful for their words, which still us and anchor us now, so that we might leave an inheritance of resistance for those who will follow. During this festival 2023, may we find stillness in the words of a Solace founder, Carter G. Woodson, who said, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history." This Asala festival is blessed. In every activity that remembers the record of resistance we have inherited and that we extend. During this festival 2023, may we stand in stillness in the encouragement of Ella Fitzgerald, who spoke in lyrical flair as she commands us to not give up what we're trying to do. Because where there is love and inspiration, we cannot go wrong. This Asala festival is blessed by every act of love and every moment that inspires. During this festival 2023, may we find stillness in the words of Frederick Douglass, which reminds us it is not light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm. We need the whirlwind and the earthquake. This Asala festival is blessed by every fire it ignites, every thunderous sound it creates, every storm, every whirlwind, every earthquake it instigates. And may we find stillness and encouragement from the late Congressman John Lewis and his exhortation to not get lost in a sea of despair, but be hopeful, be optimistic, and let us never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble. Bless the noise and the good trouble of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and its 2023 virtual festival celebrating Black resistance. May every organizer, every presenter, every activist, every school, every department, every teacher, every student, every administrator, every staff person, activist, and practitioner find moments of stillness that blesses them with new energies, stillness that births new visions, stillness that renews old hopes, and stillness that illumines others' paths to fasten our collective moral initiative in place. May we remember the power to tell the story of a people who resist, a people who persist, a people who is resilient, creative, and committed to standing against the waves of oppression. May we find ourselves formidable as we continue to struggle for freedom and democracy that includes us all. May the stilling of our heads, our hearts, and our hands in our ancestral lineages of faith, spirit, and life bless us and carry us on. Amen and Ashe.
And now, the Executive Director for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Miss Sylvia Cyrus.
Good evening. And special thanks go to Common and the Clark Atlanta Choir for that wonderful rendition of Lift Every Voice and Sing. And Reverend Dr. Shively Smith, thank you. And know that we find encouragement to make noise as a result of your blessing. Greetings and thank you for joining the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for the 97th anniversary of Black History Month, a commemoration begun by our founder, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. This year commemorates the third annual month-long Black History Month Festival, where we will explore the 2023 year-long Black History theme, Black Resistance. The Festival Planning Committee, led by Vice President for Programs Aisha Heichel, and the committee co-chairs, Dr. Gladys Gary Vaughn and Dr. Sharita Jacobs Thompson, have worked with special diligence to plan programs that highlight individuals, organizations, and movements that demonstrate the good trouble that the late Congressman John Lewis rallied us to do as we demonstrate Black resistance. Special thanks go to the entire Festival Planning Committee. In addition to the programs for our festival, we encourage you to support the programs that appear on our website at asalh.org that are sponsored by ASALH branches across the country and by ASALH members around the world. Following the presentation of the theme by the ASALH National President, Dr. W. Marvin Delaney, there will be an engaging panel discussion that we are sure you will enjoy, titled Exploring Aspects of Black Resistance, and about our president. President Delaney is a graduate of Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in history, a Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in American and African American history at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. He is a retired professor of history, and as a historian, he has served in many roles, including executive director of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture in Charleston, South Carolina, and deputy director and chief operations officer for the Dallas African American Museum. He has served as consultant on African and African American history curricula with the Fort Worth and Dallas Independent School Districts. His skills in this area are guiding ASALH through the attacks that are being faced by all who teach Black history, especially those in the state of Florida today. He has published numerous articles, essays, and reviews on civil rights, policing, and public history. Dr. Delaney has an outstanding record of service with both professional and community organizations, including his fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. As a life member, he has had a long history of participation and service with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. During the course of his career, he has encouraged and engaged students to join ASALH and to commit themselves to its mission. One of his goals as president is to significantly increase the number of members in ASALH. We encourage you to join ASALH or renew your dues today. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the program.
And now, please welcome the 27th National President for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Dr. Marvin Delaney.
Good evening. I am Marvin Delaney, President of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We use the acronym of ASALH for our organization. We are the founders of Black History Month, and it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to the opening of the third annual Black History Month Festival. The Black History Month Festival is a month-long celebration of Black history, and it provides everyone an opportunity to learn and participate in the celebration of Black history. You can participate in the many events that ASALH has planned for Black History Month by going to our website at www.asalh.org and reviewing the many activities and events that are listed as a part of the Black History Month Festival. ASALH not only plans and promotes activities and events for the celebration of Black History Month, we also choose the annual theme for the month. This year's theme for Black History Month is Black Resistance. The Executive Council of ASALH chose this theme to emphasize and highlight the ongoing struggle of African Americans in this country for social, political, and economic justice. From enslavement to Jim Crow segregation and political disfranchisement, African Americans have resisted injustice and fought all of the obstacles that limited their access to first-class citizenship in these United States. During the month-long celebration of Black history, we will illustrate and demonstrate the various aspects of Black resistance. For example, one of our programs will show how African Americans used the press as a form of Black resistance, starting with the founding of the first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, in 1827. The Black press covered stories and events in the African American community that the mainstream press often failed to cover or to tell the complete story. In its advocacy of equal rights and equal justice for African Americans, the Black press has always been an example of Black resistance. Of course, when Dr. Carter G. Woodson, ASALH's founder, started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, it was also a form of Black resistance. It was a form of Black resistance because Woodson was challenging the whole notion that African Americans had no history and had never contributed anything to world civilization. Before I close, I want to encourage you again to go to www.asalh.org and register to attend all of the programs of the Black History Month Festival. There are two programs I really want to highlight. On Wednesday, February 22nd, ASALH will feature an in-depth conversation with Dr. Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Gloria Brown Marshall will lead the discussion with Dr. Bunch. Then on Saturday, February 25th at 2:00 p.m., please join ASALH for an in-person matinee performance of Odell Ruffin's play, Campaign 72. The play is about how Shirley Chisholm defied expectations when she became the first Black woman to run a major campaign for president in 1972. I'll be there, and I hope you will too. So again, visit ASALH's website for ticket information and to learn more about other programs exploring the 2023 Black History theme, Black Resistance. See you at the festival, and thank you.
And now, let's welcome the Vice President for Programs for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Ms. Aisha Heichel, who will now introduce our program.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Aisha Heichel, and I'm pleased to open our program with moderated by Dr. Martha Beyonde of Northwestern University. And we have our panelists, Dr. Sharice Burton-Stelly and Dr. Kiaga Yamada Taylor, who will explore the aspect of Black resistance, looking at how Black resistance has been taken over throughout the country, throughout the world, and how Black people have operated in this manner. So, Martha, thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and good evening, everyone. I'm Martha Biondi. Thanks for joining this important discussion of Black resistance to launch Black History Month 2023. I'm moderating this panel this evening and will also offer a brief presentation. First, I will make introductions, and then each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes. I will then pose some questions to the panel before turning to audience questions. Please feel free to offer a question to one of the panelists using the chat function on YouTube. I'm a professor of Black Studies and History at Northwestern University. My book, To Stand and Fight, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Post-War New York City, showcased a major battleground of the Northern Civil Rights Movement. I also wrote The Black Revolution on Campus, which examines the struggle by Black students and Black scholars for affirmative action in Black studies in the 1960s and 1970s. My remarks this evening come from my current book project on U.S. solidarity with liberation struggles in Southern Africa from the 1970s through the 1990s. We will hear first this evening from Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. She is the co-author of W.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, and the co-editor of two very important volumes. The first, Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings. And the second is Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Post-Colonial State. In the fall, the University of Chicago Press will publish Dr. Burden-Stelly's first single-authored book entitled Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States. I urge everyone listening tonight to be on the lookout for this sure-to-be award-winning book. Articles by Dr. Burden-Stelly have appeared in numerous outlets and journals, including Small Axe, the Du Bois Review, Essence Magazine, and Black Perspectives. Our second speaker is Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, whom I'm very fortunate to have as a colleague. She is the Leon Forrest Professor of Black Studies at Northwestern. Dr. Taylor is author of Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Homeownership. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and winner of several awards from the Organization of American Historians. Her book, From #Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, is a landmark and best-selling account of race, politics, and policing in the United States since the 1960s. She's also the editor of the award-winning How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. A Guggenheim Fellow and MacArthur Fellow, Keeanga Taylor has written for numerous publications and is currently a contributing writer at The New Yorker. She will speak this evening from a book project that examines the Black radical tradition through the life and politics of Angela Y. Davis. I am humbled and delighted to be in conversation this evening with such brilliant and prolific scholars. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Burden-Stelly to get us started.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the association for having me to speak on this very important topic. Thank you to Martha and Keeanga for being here, two scholars I deeply admire, whose work has been formative to my own. The title of my remarks this evening is Mutual Comradeship and the Black Resistance During the McCarthyist Structure of Feeling, or the McCarthyist Conjuncture. And essentially, I want to talk a bit about what mutual comradeship is. It is the subject of my second book project, to explain a little bit about the McCarthyist conjuncture, and then to use We Charge Genocide as an example of the practice of mutual comradeship as resistance during that era. So mutual comradeship describes radical African descendants' political, ethical, and epistemological practices at the intersection of struggle on behalf of the racialized, colonized, and oppressed, and protracted anti-radical state repression. Its foundation is collaboration, reciprocal care, and learning in community rooted in political work, movement building, and guerrilla scholarship. Mutual comradeship constitutes cooperative social activity based on shared values, a common conception of social transformation rooted in the eradication of capitalist racism and the establishment and maintenance of expectations and standards through consistent struggle, debate, criticism, and self-criticism in the service of protecting and preserving not only movements and organizations, but also each other. Its guiding principle is courage, that is, the willingness to place oneself at risk for the betterment of others. Mutual comradeship further entails the lateral and intergenerational practice of legacy maintenance, including archiving, commemoration, public remembrance, and truth-telling, predicated upon the enduring commitment to, advocacy for, and protection of those who, because of their radical praxis, were intentionally erased, obscured, and or silenced from popular memory. The McCarthyist conjuncture spans roughly 1947 to 1957, exceeding the short period of the reign of Senator Joseph McCarthy from 1951 to 1954. And it describes the ways that all three branches of the US government work through and with the Black Scare and the Red Scare as cornerstones of domestic and foreign policy to effectively criminalize militant struggle and modes of thought aimed at achieving aspects of Black liberation and socialism. Executive branch entities included the State Department, the Justice Department, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Supreme Court both handed down decisions like Dennis v. United States and refused to rule on particular cases that would have ensured the political and civil rights of the central victims of anti-radical repression. Perhaps the most active and visible branch was the legislative branch, which participated through the congressional committees, including the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the Subversive Activities Control Board, and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, as well as through a cacophony of legislation, not least the 1938 Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is the act recently under which the African People's Socialist Party was indicted. The 1939 Hatch Act, the 1940 Voorhees Act, the 1940 Alien Registration Act, the 1947 Labor Management Relations Act, the Internal Security Act of 1950, and the 1954 Communist Control Act. And these are just some of, just a small subsection of the anti-radical legislation that was passed during that time or harnessed or strengthened during that epoch. During the McCarthyist conjuncture, radical Black organizer, activists, and scholars practiced mutual comradeship as a form of resistance. And the rest of the time that I have, I'll focus on We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people, as one example of this practice of mutual comradeship as resistance. On November 12, 1951, the fledgling cultural worker Beulah Richardson wrote and performed a poem called Genocide at the launch of the monumental petition. Her performances of the poem, aimed at raising awareness and support for the petition, will continue as We Charge Genocide was brought before the United Nations General Assembly and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide on December 17, 1951. Prepared by the left-wing Civil Rights Congress under the leadership of its National Executive Secretary, William L. Patterson, We Charge Genocide lambasted the United States for its centuries-long super-exploitation and denigration of 15 million African Americans. In doing so, it signaled the entry of Black Americans onto, quote, the world stage as a fighter for the dignity of mankind, its unification, and for world peace, end quote. Documenting more than 500 murders, state executions, rapes, beatings, maimings, and terroristic threats between the years 1945 and 1951. We Charge Genocide argued that the treatment of US Black nationals provided tremendous insight into the global hegemon's capitalist, racist, domestic, and foreign policy. It warned the nations of the world that, quote, a policy of discrimination at home must inevitably create racial commodities for export abroad, must inevitably tend toward war. As such, the genocide of Black people in the United States was not the, quote, private affair of Americans, but the concern of mankind everywhere, end quote. As an ethical, epistemological, and political document, We Charge Genocide embodied, cultivated, and thrived through mutual comradeship. Every aspect of the petition, from the conceptualization, drafting, and editing, to the circulation, publicizing, and filing before the United Nations, was collective and required a community of comrades. Likewise, a petition adhered in the dialectic between radical Blackness and state repression, as the CRC and its supporters navigated raising national and international consciousness about the capitalist racist genocide of Black people and its relationship to world peace, employing internationalism to cultivate solidarity and to get the petition a platform in the UN, attacks from the Subversive Activities Control Board and the US State Department, and criticism from politicians and scholars who reduced We Charge Genocide to foreign-inspired subversion. In drafting We Charge Genocide, the CRC had several objectives. The first was epistemological, that is, to provide a framework and evidence for understanding how the U.S. government's pattern of violence towards U.S. Black people conveyed a genocidal attitude and genocidal intent. The second was ethical, with the CRC envisioning the petition as a tool for all peoples fighting for freedom that would set a precedent for the United Nations to take up its moral obligation to hear nationally oppressed groups who did not have state power. The third and fourth reasons were political. Circulating the petition will convey to Black people the need to organize internationally and expand the cartography of struggle, and would demonstrate the UN's social justice potential to US citizens who did not fully grasp its utility. Finally, We Charge Genocide took a powerful political stand in making very clear the United States' racist and reactionary role in world politics that endangered world peace because, quote, no government bound up with racism could want to seek world peace, end quote. As a performance poem, Genocide shared the themes and political urgency of We Charge Genocide and helped to present its message in a different way. It demonstrated the collective trauma and humiliation of genocidal violence that foreclosed Black women, children, and men from democracy, protection, and citizenship. Its dramatization of the message of the petition allowed Richardson to create a popular cultural and political artifact that could be incorporated into speaking tours to help promote, circulate, and sell copies of the petition. As such, Richardson's poem in support of We Charge Genocide more broadly was also a form of mutual comradeship. On the one hand, her creative production and writing in newspapers like Freedom helped to publicize the petition. On the other hand, the petition gave her an opportunity to hone her craft as a writer and a performer and to bring together cultural work and political activism. Likewise, as part of a radical Black network that included organizations like the CRC and the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, and artist activists like Paul Robeson, Alice Childress, and Lorraine Hansberry, Richardson had a built-in audience among comrades. Indeed, it was William and Louise Thompson Patterson who inspired Richardson to relocate from California to New York in 1951 to deepen her work with the CRC. In turn, as historian Dale Gore explained, she, quote, continued to deploy her artistic talents in support of the organizing work of both the CRC and the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, even as both organizations faced a growing onslaught of government harassment, end quote. So to conclude, there are several lessons of resistance for today that we can learn, given that the fascistic, warmongering, and racist nature of our current society resonate very deeply with the McCarthyist conjuncture. So one lesson is that resistance must be offensive and defensive, or it is just reaction, and it's only reactionary, and I think that the petition conveys this. Second is the integral role of internationalism. As the work of the eminent historian Gerald Horne has shown us, Black people have always been internationalists in scope because our citizenship here in the United States has been tenuous at best. Next, collective and organized confrontation of the US state apparatus is absolutely essential if we hope to gain any modicum of Black liberation, freedom, or even progress. Collective and organized being the operative foci here. It's important also to join and sustain organizations, even if there are contradictions therein. We Charge Genocide was a product of an organization, its circulation, its success, and the reason why we're still talking about it today is the product of the fact that it was part of an organization and people who cared deeply about collective action. Both the poem and the petition convey the importance of collective and collaborative knowledge production as a form of resistance in a society that encourages us to be individualistic and competitive. It also conveys the importance of suspending sectarianism through practical efforts and campaigns. That is to say that if we have concrete and material demands around which we're organizing, sectarianism can be overcome. And this is conveyed, for example, in the fact that many of the signers of the petition came from different ideological and political backgrounds, but were able to close ranks around making this concrete indictment of the United States for the crime of genocide. And finally, mutual comradeship, of which the petition is one enunciation, conveys that love, courage, and care for communities, collectives, and each other are foundational to struggles and to movement building. Thank you. Now we'll have Dr. Kienga Yamada-Taylor.
Hello. Thanks again to the organizers for the invitation. As Martha indicated, this is, I'm working on a larger project about Angela Davis. And so this is an idea that I'm trying to work through that in many ways actually overlaps with some of the themes that Charisse was just talking about. So I will just jump into this, and then, hopefully we can have a discussion that might be clarifying for me, because I leave this on more of a question than a definitive statement of truth at the end. So in the historical rendition of Black radical politics and Black liberation struggles in the United States in the late 1960s and early 70s, Angela Davis looms large as part of the adorning iconography of the era. Her portraiture is as famous as that of Che Guevara, but why was Davis a target of the state and federal officials? Some of the facts are widely known. In 1969, when Davis was a precocious 25-year-old and an acting philosophy professor at UCLA, a fellow student who was also an undercover FBI agent and who had joined the Communist Party earlier, revealed in a column in the student newspaper that the philosophy department had recently hired a member of the Communist Party. A week later, a reporter with the San Francisco Examiner said that that person was Angela Davis, whom he described, the writer, described as a Maoist. After the articles appeared, Davis was confronted by the University of California Board of Regents and asked if she was a communist. She affirmed her affiliation in a letter addressed to the board, where she wrote, quote, "While I think this membership requires no justification, I want you to know that as a Black woman, I feel an urgent need to find radical solutions to the problems of racial and national minorities in white capitalist United States." The Regents fired Davis, thrusting her from local activism in Los Angeles into the national spotlight, igniting a political struggle over academic freedom, free speech, and the rights of free association. Signifying the end of one period of political repression, a California state judge found that the Regents had no right to fire Davis because of her political affiliations. This wasn't the Cold War, and in October of 1969, the faculty at UCLA voted 539 to 12 to rescind the University of California's 1950 ban on the employment of communists. But it was non-binding. So during the appeals process, Davis was allowed to teach courses, which in turn attracted thousands of students who, along with her colleagues, gave her glowing reviews. But months later, the University of California Regents, then led by board member and governor of the state, Ronald Reagan, fired Davis again. This time they claimed her political speech was unbefitting a university professor. The Regents quoted Davis saying, quote, "Hell yes, we are subversive, and we are going to continue to be until we have subverted this whole damn system." As the new justification for her dismissal, that was the new justification for her dismissal. Just as the old regime of McCarthyism was dying, new forms of political repression were taking its place. Indeed, as Davis's fate as an academic was winding its way through the California court system, she had become involved in a local solidarity campaign demanding justice for 3 prisoners known as the Soledad brothers, among them the well-known writer and Black Panther, George Jackson. In August 1970, a few months after Davis had been fired for a second time, Jackson's 17-year-old brother, Jonathan, used guns that had been registered to Angela Davis to lay siege to a courthouse in Northern California. He interrupted the trial of 2 Black inmates, gave them guns, and attempted to kidnap the judge, district attorney, and members of the jury. Guards opened fire under a dubious policy of not allowing prisoners to escape, even if it meant killing hostages. Eventually, the younger Jackson, the judge, the district attorney, and 2 inmates were killed. When news of the shooting reached Davis, she went underground, calculating that it was better to go on the run. And from August 1970 until her arrest in October, she was on the FBI's most wanted list, the 3rd woman ever to appear on it. Eventually, she was arrested at a hotel in New York City. And within weeks after a hunger strike and fighting extradition to California, Davis eventually would spend 16 months in jail, mostly in solitary confinement, awaiting trial. The attack on Davis was not only a vestige of shifting Cold War politics, where her membership in the Communist Party made her a target of those whose career had been shaped by anti-communism, including California Governor Ronald Reagan, then President Richard Nixon, and former director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. But the political attack on Davis also represented the consolidation of federal efforts to suppress the broadening and radicalizing left movements across the US. The repression of Davis was an opportunity to engage in old but effective red baiting that was synonymous with the Cold War, while also cracking down on the growing student radicalization that had been mainly expressed through opposition to the Vietnam War and the growth of the left on campuses. And finally, the attack on Davis was also in response to the hardening Black liberation movement that had been well underway. Davis would have been in the sights of the FBI, not just because of her party affiliation, but because of the escalating attack on Black revolutionaries during this time. In December of 1969, after attacks on Davis at UCLA had begun, the FBI escalated its attacks on Black radicals in Los Angeles with an audacious raid on the Black Panther Party. Davis had worked with the Black Panthers in Los Angeles and had seen the efforts of the police to destroy the group. 4 days after the FBI assassinated Fred Hampton, they launched a raid on the headquarters of the LA Black Panther Party. More than 350 police officers took on 13 Black Panthers, ostensibly to execute arrest warrants. Of the 13 Panthers, 3 were women and 5 were teenagers. Police and political operatives were not just reacting to the growing confidence of the movement on the outside, but they were also reacting to emerging solidarities between the Black movement on the outside of the prison and on the inside, exemplified by Davis's involvement in the Soledad campaign. The prosecution of Davis was important to the government. By the late 1960s, despite the seeming consolidation of power on the right with the rise of Nixon into the presidency, there was intense political polarization as well, fueled by growing disillusionment with the losing war in Vietnam and piqued by the notion that Black rebellions may actually be driven by something real beyond the caricature them as simple criminal events. Moreover, some of the successes of the left in overcoming the repressive antics of the state created a sense of political chaos. For example, even though the raid on the Panthers' headquarters in LA was an act of intimidation and overwhelming repression, Panthers resisted and were engaged in an hours-long gun battle with the police. Even though all this happened, all 13 were acquitted by a mixed-race jury. In May of 1971, 21 Black Panthers in New York, accused of all kinds of conspiracies, were also acquitted. In that same year, after spending more than a year in jail, Black Panthers Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins were almost acquitted by a jury when the judge simply dismissed the charges, arguing that it would be impossible to find a completely impartial jury to try them in front of. And of course, in March of 1972, the Soledad brothers, including George Jackson, posthumously were acquitted of the original charge of murdering a prison guard. On the one hand, these cases betrayed a growing cynicism and distrust of police, the legal system, and notions of law and order. But they also demonstrated the strategy of state actors to preoccupy Black radicals with the costly and time-consuming endeavor of legal defense and political imprisonment. And this is the context within which we have to understand the wild attack of the state upon someone like Angela Davis, an intellectual, a university professor. And to be sure, this case was also important to federal, in This case was important to federal and state officials. Not only was Davis charged with no discernible evidence against her, but federal officials escalated the attack on her by placing her on the FBI's most wanted list. And when it came time to transport Davis back to California after she lost her battle against extradition, she was whisked away in the middle at 3 a.m. in the morning by a battalion of police before being secretly placed on a military plane and flown to an air base in Northern California. Also, upon her arrest, Richard Nixon praised the FBI for the capture of, quote, the dangerous terrorist, Angela Davis. In May of 1970, just 3 months before Davis would be charged with capital crimes, a request was made of Director J. Edgar Hoover, by the San Diego office of the FBI to send a letter to the Board of Trustees at California, who were in the midst of deciding Davis's fate as a professor on the campus. In their request, the San Diego office said of Davis, she is a, quote, self-described communist who is, quote, very antagonistic towards law enforcement and the, quote, establishment, and has been observed to be a frequent participant in teach-ins and other, quote, anti-establishment demonstrations. The report goes on to offer an explanation for why Davis's employment at UCLA must be stopped. It reads, quote, it is felt that if Davis should be rehired in her position as a professor of philosophy or Black studies at UCLA, she would greatly contribute to the unrest and dissent on that campus. It is additionally felt that her employment as a professor or on any university would be inimical to the security of the United States. To thwart Davis's efforts to return to her UCLA job, the San Diego office of the FBI requested to send a fabricated letter on commercially purchased stationery and authored by a fictitious man named Leroy Johnson, opposing the rehiring of Davis because of what the office proposed to write, quote, her lesser known immoral activities. I doubt that you gentlemen are aware of the scope of Davis's promiscuous activities, but by spending a minimum amount of effort, they can rather easily be verified, end quote. The letter ends with a request for anonymity, quote, as a result of the violent nature of the reputations of several individuals with whom Davis surrounds herself. In a note from the director of the FBI, Hoover, that praised the, quote, efforts and initiative of the request, the request was rejected. Hoover wrote that while the letter was intended, was that he appreciated the spirit of the letter. He wrote, the letter was intended to remind the Board of Regents of Davis's promiscuous and extramarital conduct. Her reputation is well known to UCLA authorities. And so this is evidence of the extent to which the state was preoccupied with removing Angela Davis as a political organizer, as an activist, as a, quote, self-described communist. This kind of exchange between the local FBI and the national office was happening 3 months before she would be charged with capital crimes and put on the FBI's most wanted list. And so part of the idea that I'm trying to work through is not just the power of the state, which we often think about when thinking about the repression of the Black liberation movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but also the power of the movements that they are reacting in opposition to. So I will leave it at that. And Martha Biondi will be coming back on to give a presentation on her own research.
Thank you very much, Kianga. Okay, well, I will discuss Black American solidarity with struggles against Portuguese colonialism and white minority rule in Southern Africa. This material comes from a book that I'm writing. I argue that U.S. solidarity with Southern Africa in the 1970s was shaped by a politics of internationalism, which came to eclipse the better-known Pan-Africanism by decade's end. Nixon's escalation of the Vietnam War, commitment of major financial and military support to Portugal, the last European colonial power in Africa, and shift toward closer relations with apartheid South Africa provoked protest and dissent. The US solidarity movement was marked by internal debates and schisms, but a Black left reasserted itself and clashed with both Black nationalists and white liberals in determining which groups to support in the liberation struggles across Southern Africa. Fissures and contentious debates were the order of the day. The prominence of Black nationalism in the latter years of the Black freedom struggle had broadly affected US social movements and generated a practice of racially divided work. Arising as a countervailing influence, national liberation movements in Africa, especially the African National Congress, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea, PAIGC, and the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, FRELIMO, and the Angolan People's Liberation Movement, MPLA, began to influence and reshape US organizing. This new thinking emerged from travel, exchange, and study, especially increasing travel by African activists to the United States and Black Americans to the continent, notably to Tanzania, home to many of the national liberation organizations in exile. I argue that these debates and developments within US solidarity organizing and in the context of a diminished anti-communism amplified the stature of left internationalism and laid the groundwork for a robust US anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. I'll illustrate this point in the time allotted. First, the context. Socialism was ascendant in Africa. In the second half of the 20th century, 2/3 of new African nations adopted socialist politics, at least for a time. These new nations sought economic development and political stability by forging regional and international alliances, and by generating national cultures of trans-ethnic inclusion and solidarity. For many anti-colonial leaders, colonialism was how they had experienced capitalism and how they had experienced the West. Additionally, alarm over the advent of neo-colonialism sparked a reappraisal of nationalist imaginaries. One result was that many movements and new governments formed alliances with the socialist world. By the late 1960s, an interest in diverse forms of socialism was especially salient among leaders fighting Portuguese rule, as well as by liberation movements in white-ruled Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, and South African-controlled Namibia. For US activists, the context was also changing. The course of the war on Vietnam, revelations about government lies, and the strength of the anti-war movement had pushed many Americans to question the appropriateness of viewing national liberation struggles through an East-West lens. And more generally, it shattered the Cold War notion that foreign policy was beyond the bounds of permissible dissent. These trends were especially notable among youth, intellectuals, liberal churches, and progressive unions. The successes of the Black freedom struggle put particular pressure on Washington's strategic and anti-communist defense of apartheid South Africa. The contradiction between the morality of one and the immorality of the other would become more glaring in the 1980s with Reagan's more wholehearted embrace of the white minority regime. But in the 1970s, many radical activists moved beyond criticizing American foreign policy to a more robust identification and solidarity with those organizations and nations on the other side of US largesse. These individuals, their overseas travel, including personal exposure to African freedom struggles, their print culture, and the organizations and networks they formed, constituted a non-governmental US internationalist movement. This constellation allied with the internationalism of the ANC, PAIGC, FRELIMO, SWAPO, and the MPLA. For the most part, this solidarity movement did not see itself as pro-Soviet, even though a small communist movement remained active in this network. Rather, US internationalists looked to non-state organizations or to Cuba and post-independence Mozambique. Tanzania and Zambia were also crucial in providing bases and shelter for the national liberation struggles. Critical in influencing African-American activist opinion in the US was the rising organizational capacity of the Black left, the important US visits and publications of Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the PAIGC, and Walter Rodney, the Guyanese scholar activist who lived in Tanzania and Jamaica. In terms of organizational capacity, a host of new initiatives, media, and organizations arose in the 1970s and beyond. My book focuses on Chicago activists and their local, national, and international solidarity work. Chicago activist Prexy Nesbitt helped to launch the New York-based African Information Service, as well as the Chicago-based African American Solidarity Committee. He also formed the Chicago Committee for the Liberation of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, the U.S. Out of Angola Committee, the Committee Against Bank Loans to South Africa, and in the 1980s, the Mozambique Support Network, among several additional anti-apartheid organizations. Lawyer and activist Robert Van Lierop, who was of Caribbean descent, co-founded the African Information Service with Nesbitt in Harlem. The organization hosted Amilcar Cabral in 1972. Cabral visited the AIS office in Harlem, where he had asked them to organize a meeting of Black organizations. He spoke to a packed room of about 120 people. The AIS later published a selection of Cabral's speeches, plus a transcript of his conversation with the audience that day in Harlem. It was titled Return to the Source, Selected Speeches of Amilcar Cabral, and it had an enormous influence on Black American radicals. To this audience of revolutionary nationalists, cultural nationalists, communists, socialists, liberals, artists, cultural workers, and certainly government informants, Cabral offered insights that challenged many political assumptions in the United States. Like other internationalists waging wars of liberation in the 1970s, he disavowed simple analogies across the diaspora, even as he championed the ethic of solidarity and sought support from Black Americans. He opened his speech by unpacking his greeting. Naturally, if you ask me between brothers and comrades what I prefer, if we are brothers, it is not our fault or our responsibility. But if we are comrades, it is a political engagement. Naturally, we like our brothers, but in our conception, it is better to be a brother and a comrade. In combating racism, he explained, we don't make progress if we combat the people themselves. We have to combat the causes of racism. He stressed the importance of responding to the unique circumstances of lived conditions across the African diaspora and forging a plan for revolutionary change. Moreover, even as a leader of an armed struggle, he refused to celebrate armed struggle. Maybe I deceive people, but I am not a great defender of the armed fight. I myself am very conscious of the sacrifices demanded of the armed fight. The AIS was also instrumental in introducing many American activists to the worldview and hopes and dreams of Frelimo, the Mozambican Liberation Front. This was another socialist-leaning national liberation organization fighting against Portuguese colonialism. In 1971, in fear of Portuguese aerial bombardment, Van Lierop traveled with Frelimo guerrillas into liberated territory in Mozambique to make the film A Luta Continua, a path-breaking 30-minute documentary film explaining Portuguese colonialism and Frelimo's armed fight to an American audience. It was extraordinarily influential. A Luta Continua was screened hundreds of times across the United States. It showcased Frelimo's armed struggle and a vision for a new democratic society, as well as the violence and barbarism of Portuguese colonialism. Crucially, it emphasized the role of the US and NATO in aiding the Portuguese subjugation of the Mozambican people. A Luta Continua brought socialist internationalism to African-American audiences. Community groups, churches, and students sponsored screenings in Chicago. The Chicago Committee for the Liberation of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea held over 100 screenings between the spring of '73 and 1974 alone. A screening at Dunbar High School in Chicago's South Side became an important moment to teach about Mozambique to a large audience of ordinary people, because two Frelimo leaders were there and spoke, UN Representative Sharfuddin Khan and Joaquim Chissano, a future president of Mozambique. And another example of the revival of the Black left around African solidarity work, in 1971, a coterie of activists in Chicago founded the African American Solidarity Committee, whose major focus that decade was the production of a monthly newsletter called The African Agenda that disseminated coverage and analysis of events and struggles in the Third World from a Black anti-imperialist perspective. It became an indispensable and rare source of such information across Chicago and via left networks to a much wider readership. It reprinted speeches from leaders of the ANC, MPLA, and Frelimo, and offered detailed analysis of US and European foreign policy and corporate activity. It gave extensive coverage to the liberation movements and the global internationalists immersed in solidarity work. In closing, I want to emphasize the leading role of African liberation organizations and activists in asserting the primacy of their agendas, their outlooks, and their strategies to global audiences, including Black Americans. Indeed, these organizations and activists decisively shaped the nature of solidarity work, whether that was requests for material aid or for educational and consciousness raising work, or to mobilize pressure on the government as a means to influence US foreign policy in the region. Okay, well, I will conclude now, and we can shift to the question and answer segment among the panelists, and then we'll engage questions from the audience on YouTube. I want to encourage audience members to submit questions on the YouTube channel's chat function. Now I would like to welcome back my fellow panelists.
Hey there.
Okay, great. I loved each of your presentations, and I have a couple of questions that I would love to offer. Professor Burden-Stelly, I was really drawn to your conceptualization of mutual comradeship, and I would invite you to tell us more about the origins of this concept. For example, it strikes me as resonant with contemporary discourses around mutual aid. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit of the backstory of your intellectual process as you came to this theorization.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And thank you both for your presentations. So I actually am quite critical of the current conceptualization of mutual aid because I feel like the mutual and mutual aid falls out. Oftentimes the mutual and mutual aid as praxis has to do, it moves beyond sort of charity or donating to somebody's GoFundMe or providing particular aspects of material support, which is extremely important. But the next level is sort of reciprocity and consciousness raising that is inscribed in those acts of mutual exchange. And so, and I'm sure that there are networks that are offline that do practice mutual aid in that way. But I think that, like all terms that emanate from the left, they can become quite abstracted and take on sometimes liberal individualist meaning. That notwithstanding, I think that I came to mutual comradeship actually maybe in 2015 or 2016. A comrade of mine, Alex Adamson, was doing a paper about CLR James and comradeship. And at that time, so maybe it was 2016, I was doing research on W.E.B. Du Bois and looking at the ways that Black women had shaped his consciousness around a whole host of things. And so my first piece on mutual comradeship, which is actually just about to come out this year, because you know how those edited volumes work. But anyway, it's called The Mutual Comradeship Between W.B. Du Bois and Radical Black Women. And it looked at the sort of the network of exchange and care and concern that really is at the intersection of radical organizing and state repression. And so I wanted to think about not just the sort of political forms of struggle in which people engage, but like, how did they sustain themselves? How was it that they were under extraordinary duress in an unrelenting way, but still were able to sustain organizations? When one organization was shut down, they started another one, right? And there was a kind of a cadre or a group of people that moved through these organizations and these institutions, like from freedom to freedom ways, for example. And so I really was thinking about what are the ethical foundations of struggle, right? And then I talked about epistemology as well. How does a sort of rethinking, reimagining, and re-understanding of the world also ground a particular type of politics? And so, you know, the concept, so I've been thinking about mutual comradeship for a really long time. I've written about it in the context of Du Bois, both with Radical Black Women, but also with Shirley Graham Du Bois, but also Claudia Jones and Doxie Wilkerson and Marvell Cook. I just found these really interesting friendships that were comradeships or marriages, right? That were about love, right? Eros, but also about like courage, like mutual commitment to each other and to struggle. So, the Thompsons are Louise Thompson Patterson and William Patterson are an example of that. And so really just thinking about what is this sort of, you know, Fanon talks about the new human, right? If it is that we're striving toward a new human through struggle, through Black liberation and socialism, there are sort of internal transformations that have to happen. There are relational transformations, the way that we relate to ourselves, the way that we relate to each other and to the environment, which of course is Cabral's definition of culture. these shifts have to take place. And so mutual comradeship, I think, is a framework through which I tried to understand that. So hopefully that answers some aspect of your question.
Thank you. It absolutely does. And I actually want to follow up, if I may, with another question that your work really raised for me. You know, the McCarthy era is often interpreted as a period when the American left is just vanquished or is just unraveling, marginalized, sidelined, and its ideas sort of demonized and stigmatized. But your story, I think, really complicates that narrative and counters that narrative. In your story, you know, we hear about survival and ongoing commitment to radical resistance and radical ideas by, you know, an important coterie of Black activists. So how does this analysis, your analysis of the McCarthy conjuncture, help us like rethink the 1950s or even rethink the dominant narratives of the Black freedom struggle?
Sure. Well, number one, so, you know, I always say I'm not a historian. I'm historically nosy. And so I'm allowed to play with time in ways that historians are not. You all have to study like 1619 to 1671, like very kind of discrete time periods. That's part of the training and practice. I'm a Black studies scholar, so I don't have to do that. I could kind of create these problem spaces or play with time in a way that I think. And you know, historians do all sorts of interesting things. It's no shade to historians, and some historians are Black studies scholars, so don't come at me. But what I'm saying is that there's a way that I can really focus in on striking continuity. Not as opposed to, but in relationship to sort of change over time. I think that helps me to kind of track these continuities or the ways that things are sustained, the ways that things do stay not the same. Like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, but there's continuities. And so I think it's really the work of Dale Gore that helps us that really starts this rethinking of the Cold War era as not just one of profound loss and repression, but of the ongoing nature of radical struggle, even as repression is sort of ubiquitous. But if you look at somebody like Louise Thompson Patterson, she's active from the Harlem Renaissance through to what Kienga's talking about, right? She's the, I think, executive secretary of the Free Angela Davis Committee. Marvell Cook is like the treasurer of the Free Angela Davis Committee. So these are people who are transgenerational organizers and activists who are doing this work. And I think that because they're doing some of the work at the margins, because they belong to organizations, and we don't typically study organizations, it can only be about sort of how they were repressed or how things were curtailed, but things don't come out of nowhere. The Council on African Affairs creates the conditions for the anti-apartheid struggle of the 1980s. And there's, in fact, some of those same figures who are present. So anyway, and this is not to make a transhistorical argument, but I think it's really important to pay attention to those striking continuities, because that's what kind of, that's how we continue, right? Otherwise we would just like ball up and die. So yeah.
Can I just say something about that? Because I think that is a good point. Like, especially the Free Angela Davis movement in 1971, 1972, that part of the reason why it was so successful as an international movement was, of course, the role that the Communist Party played. And so, you know, someone like William Patterson, in particular, who began his political career doing as a lawyer in a Sacco and Vanzetti defense campaign in the 1920s, and then went on to lead the Communist Party's work in the Scottsboro Boys campaign, and then went to play a leading role in the campaign to free the Rosenbergs from execution by the US government, brings all of this experience of fighting political repression, fighting for the freedom of political prisoners to the Angela Davis campaign. And of course, it's not just him, but it's an entire cadre of communists who have been through the wars of the American state, who are able to think broadly and not narrowly in this context. So, the point about continuity is very is sort of alive in the Free Angela Davis movement.
Great. Well, maybe Kianga, we can keep you in the conversation.
Sure.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your reading of Davis's FBI file. I mean, a lot of scholars and sort of, have warned us to be careful in how we read FBI documents, that we need to read them with a lot of care because they're filled with political misreadings and biased assumptions and just outright errors and other flaws. So can you give us a little insight on, what you've learned about the character of state surveillance from your reading of Angela Davis's FBI file?
Well, I think the main thing that I probably have time to talk about here is the way that as a Black woman, they conceptualize how you undermine her political authority. And it is not just in the surveillance, but it is the way that the state itself is going to pursue her, the strategy, the strategic pursuit that they undertake in the trial itself. So from the FBI files, it's all, we will undermine the character of Angela Davis by painting her as sexually promiscuous, as involved with married men, having extramarital affairs. And they say within the documents that they are literally making things up. They are making up people to write letters. They are making up the content of the letters. But this is a character that they want to try to slip onto her. And from J. Edgar Hoover's aside, within this one particular report, he makes it sound as if this is an ongoing strategy. So the San Diego office makes this one particular request, and this is the particular approach they want to take. Hoover, when he rebuffs them, makes it clear that we've already been in touch with the Board of Regents to alert them to the behavior of Angela Davis. So that's one thing. The other quick thing is in the trial, they have no evidence. And so the narrative, strategic narrative of the state becomes, well, Angela Davis is an impassioned woman who wants to free her lover, George Jackson, from prison. And so she loses sense of her faculties and engages in this completely reckless campaign because she's overwhelmed by passion. And so on the one hand, she is the conniving, manipulative communist who is a political mastermind who's taking dictation straight from the Soviet Union. And on the other hand, she's a passionate woman scorned who is can't resist her lover, and so she has lost all judgment and engages in a completely insane, reckless strategy that has no chance of winning. And so it's interesting to look at, this is an era of the development of Black feminist consciousness, and that part of that is understanding the particular ways that Black women experience racism, but how that is gendered in a specific kind of way that Black men don't necessarily have to contend with, but that shapes how the state views the Black women as a way to attack them.
Mm-hmm. Well, switching kind of keys a little bit, you're writing about somebody who is a major intellectual, a major activist who's been in the public sphere for decades. And so, do you want to tell us a little bit about that process and how that feels? And then maybe if you could, give us a little teaser, something you feel like we don't know about Angela Davis, something that's been underappreciated. Some ways she's been misunderstood.
I think
anything.
Just, I think that I'm trying to think of like what a good metaphor is of something that you see all the time and think that you completely understand, but then, you actually don't understand it at all. And so I think that Angela Davis is, people know her face, people know her hair, people know her name, but I don't think that people fully know and appreciate her political insights and contributions. In some ways, I think that it's a function of sexism and how we understand the political contributions that came from the 1960s. I think there's an element of anti-communism that she is seen as, because she was, for the duration of time that she was in the Communist Party, that it's assumed that her politics are a part of a party line, that they are a kind of canned thing that is not necessarily organic or that comes out of her experience, but that is part of this, deeply demonized organization, and thus is not really taken seriously. And so I think that, that is part of why I was interested in Davis, because she was someone that, I sort of always, whose presence I took for granted, but whose ideas, I had not really thought about. And so, I think that there's this historical period within which she becomes widely known. But, I'm also interested in the ways that her political development happens over time, that both keeps her engaged in radical politics, but also leads her to new types of ideas and conclusions about the nature of capitalism in the United States, and how these ideas influence her own conceptions about prison and the state, and commitments to socialism. So, I'm interested in figuring out how her politics develop, how they diverge from Communist Party politics, how in many ways she is coming up with new and different formulations, particularly around Black feminists or Black women's liberation politics, which are not very popular in the Communist Party. And yet she is a pioneer of some of these ideas over the course of the 70s and certainly into the 1980s. So I think that there's a lot there that we don't know. And, I'm interested in trying to unearth that and look at least her particular trajectory through this Black radical tradition. Her parents were fellow travelers of the Communist Party in the 1930s. She's a member of the Communist Party in the 1960s, and then maintains her political commitments into the 21st century. So I think that she provides a particular pathway to try to understand what is meant by Black radical traditions, really.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question to bring you into the
Sure. I just wanted to, if I could, I just noticed that all three of us, basically, it's like Black communists or socialists, like we're in our talks, right? But I still feel like there's still this powerful strain in American political culture to see socialist and communist movements as really, as always already white.
Yes.
And so I don't know. I would love to hear maybe Cherise, to you, just like any thoughts about that. And I mean, did that influence why you chose Black Scare, Red Scare as like a title for your book? Because you want to be sort of forceful and, you know, and sort of as a rejoinder to that kind of whitening narrative. I don't know how you each, I'd love to hear your thoughts and how you think about it. And then, of course, I'm happy to, you know, answer your question, Sharice.
So I'm going to start with the question, and you could choose to engage or not engage. But one of the questions is about internationalism, and like, so obviously there's these different competing factions, right? So for example, in Angola, there's UNITA, MPLA, you know, there in Zimbabwe, there is ZAPU and ZANU. In South Africa, there's the ANC and the PAC. And so I just wondered how those different conflicts or competing liberations, right, competing involvements in liberation struggles in Southern Africa, how did that shape, and how was it shaped by this internationalism that you are like carefully mapping out? So that's just my question. In terms of my answer, I co-edited this book called Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing, specifically to challenge this idea that like Marxism is white shit, right? And I feel like that is that sort of refrain, that it's Eurocentric, because Marx's locus of enunciation was Europe, specifically Great Britain, in terms of his analysis, is a lazy way to dismiss something that was integral to every single liberation, every single person in the, not every single, but the vast majority of people struggling in the global South for liberation, was engaging with Marxism in some way. And as Fanon says, stretching Marxism, updating it, right? Because as we know, by the 1960s, it is the global South, it is the third world that's updating and keeping scientific socialism, right? So scientific socialism is not reducible to Marxism, but scientific socialism, it's keeping it alive and keeping it active. And so I think this idea that, you know, scientific socialism is for white folks allows for the sort of continued hegemony of like bourgeois idealism, and it allows for, in the conscience of our country, Americanism to continue to stand in for any sort of Marxist or class analysis. And so I think that it's a politics, right? And some of that critique, I think, is warranted insofar as there are a lot of Marxists or scientific socialists who only see race as epiphenomenal. But if we take seriously the Black communists who have been there from the outset, literally somebody like Grace Campbell, they always took the Negro question as central, period. And they were always waging struggle within the party against white chauvinism and against the sort of marginalization of the Negro question, period. They're Black and they know it, and they understand, at least in the context of the United States, the way that race and class are mutually constitutive. And so I think ignoring those Black communists, Black socialists, Black leftists allows for that distortion in ways that continue the imperial, capitalist, liberal, like bourgeois orientation of this society.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that it was definitely a motivation for me, and especially in the aftermath of the two presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders. I think that that narrative of socialism as white took on new life and new significance. And so I think Angela Davis is particularly interesting because of the history of her parents, but also, you know, she grew up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1940s, and her entire social milieu was constituted with Black communists. These were members of the CP who had come from New York to Birmingham to be involved in radical politics and to organize. And these were the you know, best friends of Angela Davis that she grew up with. One of whom, Margaret Burnham, went on to be part of her legal team in the 1970s. And so the idea that, you know, the kind of outside agitator, the wily, you know, white communists riling up the natives is completely racist and ridiculous, and has no bearing in the actual history of Black people who came to the conclusion that American capitalism was irrevocably broken and sought out alternative politics, ideas, and analyses to understand their own condition, but also looking for a politics that could actually free them from the vestiges of racism, oppression, and exploitation that defined all of American society.
Mhm. Thank you very much. Well, we are going to be concluding very shortly, but first I'll just offer some comments, Charisse, to your question. So yes, those the rival organizations and many of these struggles in Southern Africa were, a part of the story of the 1970s. And so solidarity efforts in the US, were often divided in who they wanted to support. I think what happened in many cases is that they, in some ways, followed the lead of who was judged to be sort of the most popular or most independent or won majority support. And then in the case of like UNITA in Angola, revelations came out that Savimbi had gotten some secret support from Portugal even, and then from apartheid South Africa as they were waging really revanchist campaigns in later years. So that certainly influenced the choices that activists made here. So it's a very obviously complex story, but I think that activists, made choices based on ideology, made choices based on relationships and connections, and then ultimately made choices based on, like who won elections, and things of that sort. So, but there were lots of debates around that, many of which became very fractious. Well, I want to thank Charisse Burden-Stelly and thank Kianga Yamana Taylor, and thank you, the audience, for your tremendous taking the time and opportunity to join us this evening. It's been a great discussion, and I look forward to a fabulous Black History Month with Asala, and please join the other events of the festival. I'm going to turn it over right now to Aisha Heikel, who's on the programming committee. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much, Martha, for moderating that wonderful discussion. I hope you can all give a virtual in your house round of applause for the insightful comments and presentations that they've given us tonight. I know I was frantically writing down books and people to go back and review, and so thank you for that as well. And so I want to thank you all again for being with us this evening for the opening ceremony for the Black History Month Festival. We hope that you can join us for the rest of the week's programming on Asala TV, which features a book talk with Ibram Kendi, and a discussion of Black landowners and farmers called Reclaiming Land and Civil Rights. More information on these programs and the rest of the festival programming can be found on asala.org/festival. And please join or renew your Asala dues so that we can support and continue to have programming such as this. As we close this program, I want to leave you with a memory from one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison, who, when reflecting on when her books being banned in Texas prisons due to the administration saying that her books may incite a riot, she said, "How powerful is that? I could tear up the whole place." Furthermore, she wrote in her novel Jazz, "What is the world for you if you cannot make it up the way you want it?" So for this month and for this year, think about where your power lies. And as the panelists indicated, a collective power as well, and use it to make this world a better place. And I will now turn it over to a recording from Tuskegee University, who will be performing John Saw the Numbers. Thank you.
To close the opening program, here is the Tuskegee University Choir performing John Saw the Number, directed by Dr. Wayne Barr, Director of Choral Activities.
Coming
thank you for joining us for our opening program exploring aspects of Black resistance. Please be sure to join us for our upcoming programs that will be underway for the entire month. On Thursday, February the 2nd, PBS Books Author Talk presents Ibram X. Kendi to discuss his work under the heading Music as Resistance. This program will go live from 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. On Saturday, February the 4th, at 12 p.m. Eastern, Asala presents this program, Black Landowners and Farmers, Reclaiming Land and Civil Rights. Also, on Saturday, February the 4th, Asala, in partnership with the Mount Pleasant Neighborhood Library, presents the screening of Berry Farm, Community, Land, and Justice. This film will be screened from 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern to 4 o'clock p.m., and it will be held at 3160 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. This event is free to the public. On Sunday, February the 5th, Asala presents a very special program entitled Warrior Queen Nzinga, Tell Them We Fought Back. This program will start at 5:30 p.m. Eastern and will be available on Asala TV. On Monday, February the 6th, Asala presents the first of 3 Asala Virtual Author Book Talks. This program will begin at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. On Tuesday, February the 7th, Asala presents the program African American Music and the Struggle for Freedom. This program will kick off at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. And on Wednesday, February the 8th, Asala, in partnership with the National Park Service, presents Walk in the Footsteps of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. In this spellbinding first-person delivery, Dr. Woodson will take visitors from the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House National Historic Site on an interpretive journey to Dr. Woodson's residence in the Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C. This walking tour will start promptly at 11 a.m. Eastern and is open to the public. To register, please go to our website at www.asalh.org. On Thursday, February the 9th, Asala presents Call and Response, Liberation Theology, Resistance, and the Black Church. This program will begin at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern. On Monday, February 13th, Asala will present the second of our 3 virtual author book talks. This program will begin promptly at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. On Wednesday, February the 15th, Asala will present the program Poetry, Fighting with Words, Then and Now. This program will begin at 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. On Wednesday, February the 15th, PBS Books presents its second Books Author Talk featuring New York Times reporter Jonathan Abrams in conversation with Angel Ito. This program will be going live from 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. On Thursday, February 16th, Asala will present the Carter G. Woodson Home Grand Reopening Preview Program. This program will start at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. On Sunday, February 19th, Asala presents Preserving Black Resistance. This program begins at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. And on Tuesday, February the 21st, Asala presents the 2023 Annual Book Prize event. This program will kick off at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. And on Wednesday, February the 22nd, Asala presents the virtual marquee event, a conversation with Secretary Lonnie Bunch III of the Smithsonian Institution. This program will begin at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on Asala TV. And on Thursday, February the 23rd, Asala presents Resistance and the Black Press. This event will start at 7 o'clock Eastern on Asala TV. On Saturday, February the 25th, Asala presents The Chisholm Effect National Tour Campaign 72. This performance will be held at the Arc Theater located at 1901 Mississippi Avenue Southeast in Washington, D.C. Performance begins at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information on how to acquire tickets, please visit our website or call our office for more information. And on Monday, February 27th, ASALA presents the final installment of the virtual Author Book Talks, beginning at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on ASALA TV. And on Tuesday, February the 28th, ASALA will conclude the month-long festival with our closing program starting at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on ASALA TV. We would also like to thank our sponsors who have made this festival possible with their generous support and financial contributions. First, we would like to thank our legacy sponsors and our History Maker sponsors, our preservation sponsors, and our media sponsors. Without your help and support, this event would not be possible. If you would like more information on how to be a sponsor or a member of ASALA, please go to our website at www.asalh.org to learn more about how you can become a part of History in the Making with ASALA. Or you can contact our offices at 202-238-5912. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications bell for our YouTube channel, ASALA TV, so you can be alerted to all of our programming when we go live. You can also follow us on our social media platforms via Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest information pertaining to all of our virtual events for 2023. We look forward to seeing you at our next event right here on ASALA TV.